Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I just watched the Sam Shamoon and Khalil Andani debate on the Islamic Dilemma and whether or not the Islamic Dilemma passes, meaning that Islam is false, the Quran is false, Muhammad was not a true prophet, or does it fail? Is it something that doesn't pass at all and Christians and non-Muslims should stop using it? So the first point I want to make is that I think Sam did a very good job demonstrating that the Islamic dilemma is the more reasonable and less challenging position to hold. I think it is more probable, and I think he succeeded in demonstrating that the Islamic dilemma is more probable than not. Hence, a reasonable person should hold to it. But there's a reason why I say non-Muslims are wrong when they make this argument, because it isn't just Christians. Khalil gave the impression that this was just a Christian thing. It isn't at all. The Islamic dilemma can be used by anyone who isn't a Muslim or who wants to demonstrate that the Quran is inconsistent as a text. So Sam Shamoon can make the Islamic dilemma argument, David Wood can make the Islamic dilemma argument, I can make it, my atheist friend down the road could make it, a Jewish person, a rabbinic Jew could make it, a Buddhist could, a Hindu could, anyone could, because it really doesn't depend on prior religious beliefs to make the argument. Now, Khalil Andani, like from what I've seen, seems like an awesome guy. He seems very calm, respectful, and doing his best to conduct the debate in a proper manner. And I have to respect him for that. And also I respect the fact that he has clearly achieved a lot in his life. Being an academic and being able to speak about these issues is a pleasure. That being said, though, I do disagree with quite a few things that he said, because I think ultimately a lot of what he talks about simply isn't more likely than the alternative. So let me give you some examples. Khalil Andani mentions that the Quran clearly does not make a case for a particular New Testament canon, for example. And I think that's kind of true. Gabriel Reynolds talks about this, and I've mentioned this in prior videos. The Quran seems very flexible in what it considers to be that Injil. It isn't as if it's taking a definitive approach and that is explicitly mentioned anywhere. It isn't. In fact, as a methodology, we have to read the Quran, see the things that it mentions, and that can give us insight as to what the Quran seems to think that Injil is. Now, there are reasons and there are arguments to be made that it affirms a significant amount of the New Testament canon as we understand it today and as how it would have been understood by the majority of Christians back then at the time of Muhammad. But you don't have to say this. You don't have to make this argument. I know Sam made this argument and I think he did an amazing job at that. But I also think that to meet the criteria to demonstrate that the Quran is inconsistently contradicting itself and hence cannot be from God, from a theological point of view, we would say that actually only certain aspects of the prior scriptures need to be affirmed as inspired, preserved, and authoritative in order for the Quran to be inconsistent and for the Islamic dilemma to be met. For example, Gabriel Reynolds has pointed out that there seems to be quotations that are very similar to Paul's writings, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, for example, that you can find in the Quranic corpus. Might be a reflection of Paul's sayings, maybe it isn't. But that's besides the point. We can just look at very clear sayings in the Quran, what Gabriel considers biblical inflections, to demonstrate that the Quran establishes from its own perspective what it thinks this Injil is. Now I'm going to focus on the Injil for most of this video because that was what the debate was largely about. There wasn't much talk of the Torah, but most of it focused rather on the Injil. So I think it's quite clear that the Quran establishes a few things. It clearly refers to the canonical understanding of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the Gospel, the Injil, as a minimum. The reason I think this is because there are terms that are used in the Quran that seem to originate with some of these Gospels. For example, the particular and very unique and potentially mistranslated passage from the biblical text where it talks about where it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle, for a rich man who wants to go into heaven is the context for that. Well, that particular phrase is obviously very interesting to most of us because it seems like camel going through an eye of needle. Well, we find again the same kind of thing in the Quran, the same phrase. That to me I don't think is an accident. I think that's the Quran borrowing these terms to make arguments in favor of the validity of the text and the validity of the prophet who revealed the text. Likewise, we have the example of using the mustard seed. I think again quite a well-known one, or would have been well-known at the time of Muhammad, is the smallness of the mustard seed. Well, likewise, the smallness of the mustard seed is affirmed in the Quran. We can go further with this. For example, Surah 19, we have John talked about, or Yahya, as the Quran calls him. Well, Yahya is supposedly someone who has a name that has never been given to anyone before, which seems quite strange, and it seemed to confuse perhaps a few early Islamic scholars who were looking at this passage and giving their tafsirs on this passage. Well, we know as Christians Christians, from our point of view, we know where that comes from. It comes, for example, from the Gospel of Luke, where it talks about how John was a name that was not found in Zechariah's family line. I think it's quite clear that the Quran is borrowing phrases and terms from this canonical Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We can also say that this is reasonable given the widespread usage of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to be colloquially known as the good news. We also know from the root word of Injil traces itself ultimately to the Evangelion, the good news in Greek, and so there's an etymological argument to be made there as well. I think this is reasonable and more likely than not, and there would need to be substantial evidence to demonstrate this isn't the case. Khalil himself, I think, agrees with this as far as I'm aware and what I could get from that debate. What I would say, though, again, this comes from looking into things, reading the text for myself, looking at other sources and looking at the works of people like Gabriel Reynolds, for example, who have pointed out that the Quran doesn't just stop there. The Quran doesn't just stop at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the Injil. It goes further than that. It seems to be under the impression, given the fact that the Quran is quite clearly quoting from other sources that are involved in the upbringing of Mary, the birth of Yahya, Jesus as a baby. These things quite clearly have an origin, and we know for a fact that a lot of these stories are not found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are found in the Proto-Evangelion of James. They are found in, you have to trace it back, but ultimately to the Gospel of Thomas. Now, there's other things I think it quite clearly quotes, but these demonstrate to me, given the fact that these are about Jesus or Jesus' Sahaba, his contemporaries, his companions at his time, that this must be understood as the sayings of Jesus and the stories around that. We can also just look at it plainly. It would have been known in its historical context that the majority of Christendom does not affirm these things to be canon. So when the Quran obviously quotes them, because to a knowledgeable Christian who has encountered this tradition, they would know, hey, that's not in our scriptures, that's not in our canon, that's a heterodox view that has its origins elsewhere. Well, they would clearly be able to point this out to Muslims and say, hey, look, this is not what you think it is. This leads me to think that whoever the author or authors of the Quran were just making an argument that this is valid, this is acceptable, this is something that we can appeal to as a legitimate saying or a legitimate story of either Isa or the companions of Isa or his family of Isa. That to me seems to be the most reasonable and the most likely from what I've seen. I think it would be quite a challenge to demonstrate that that's not the case, or that there's a more reasonable, more likely alternative. And I want people to think about this. The Islamic Dilemma is in effect when the Quran references other texts as being authoritative under an umbrella term like the Injil, but the Injil itself in its historical context does not agree with the Quran. That's the basis of the dilemma. Well, you see, that's interesting, but so far I've just been thinking about that in the context of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Remember, I've just explained how the Injil in the eyes of the Quranic author or authors is probably more than that. It's probably Proto-Evangelion of James, Gospel of Thomas, or the Syriac Infancy Gospel, or something like that. So how would you reconcile the Quran with these texts? You would have to employ the same methodology, and I think that methodology is problematic. One final point on this as well. The Quran assumes that the reader is familiar with the stories contained within the canon of the Torah, the stories of Musa, of Ibrahim, etc., and of those of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It makes no attempt at trying to clarify anything explicitly. Everything is done in the context of, you already know this, but remember this story? Well, this is how this story relates to this. Or this is how this story shows something about Allah and the messenger he's sending to you today. And that's another reason why I think it's quite clear that it affirms some part of the canon as we understand it. Maybe not all of it, but definitely some part of it. Okay, so let's move on to my second point. Khalil Andani, he makes the argument that the Quran acts as a confirmer, a muhaymin, a guardian over the prior scriptures, and hence the Quran is the final authority on this. Now, I want people to understand, this primarily comes from a single verse in the Quran, which is Surah Al-Ma'idah, ayah 48. Such a doctrine to be established just through that verse is it's not very, how can I put this? It calls into question certain exegetical interpretations of the Quran. If to establish an entire doctrine, because again, this is a pretty hefty and pretty significant doctrine in terms of how you look at scripture holistically as a whole in the Islamic worldview, to just say this verse and to rely on this word, and Khalil Andani even admits that this word has a wide semantic range, so it could mean many different things, and early tafsir writers disagreed about this. I think that's a weak argument. I think that's very weak, because to develop entire doctrines from that is not putting the best foot forward, so to speak. It's also, as many people have pointed out, kind of assuming the truth of Islam in the first place. It's a little bit circular. It's something that I would expect from someone who has a priori beliefs that they're going to defend at all costs and have already come to this conclusion. It's basically assuming that the Quran is infallible, therefore it cannot mean anything other than this. And I find that to be difficult, and not from an academic position, not from a position of someone trying to find truth, but rather it's a defensive apologetic to try to deal with issues like the Islamic Dilemma and the variants of it that come off the Islamic Dilemma. Now, that could actually be solved pretty easy. All the Quran we need to do is make it quite explicit somewhere, perhaps in a couple more verses maybe, where the Quran makes it clear that the previous scriptures, the Injil, the Torah, that are in possession of the Christians and Jews have been corrupted in such a way that they have been irreconcilably altered wholly, universally, and therefore are no longer available or in access to any Christian. The reason why Muslims like Khalil Andani and others would probably want to go that far, and during the debate he made a very positive case for a very significant form of textual corruption, is because, first of all, otherwise there has to be multiple Injils, and this is where things get complicated. Say, for example, and this is kind of the classic example I always give, but if I took a Quran from my bookshelf and I altered the Quran textually, so I've written things, I've changed it in such a way that I fundamentally change it, and I then tell you that I have corrupted the Quran, the first thing you're going to say is, hang on a sec, Chris, you're using terms that are wholly inappropriate and not properly defined, because as soon as you find out when I say I've corrupted the Quran, all I really mean is a single copy I had, you're going to say that you haven't corrupted anything. All you've done is you've just changed one local copy, and it's probably not actually even in Arabic, so even then it's not sufficient. But even if it was an Arabic copy, and even if I wrote it in perfect Arabic, my corrupted form, it's still not corrupting the Quran. Rather, I've only corrupted a copy of the Quran, which is much more appropriate to say. So when we talk about textual corruption, the word copy needs to get in there somewhere. It's not that the Injil and Torah have been textually corrupt, it's that the copies of the Injil and Torah have been textually corrupt. In which case, the next question is, how many copies and where? And if we just say a reasonable high amount, say we say 50%, 50% of all the copies across all of Christendom have been altered in the same way somehow, what would that mean? That doesn't actually help the Muslim apologist here, because you now have an issue where you have multiple Injils. Why is that a problem? Well, the Quran never mentions multiple Injils. The Quran makes it quite clear there is an Injil. It never makes any distinctions between this Injil and that Injil. As far as the Quran is concerned, there's just an Injil. And it's the Injil that is described in Quran 3 verse 3. It's the same one that is talked about in Surah Al-Ma'idah 68, Surah Al-Ma'idah 47. And so there's no indication in the Quran there are multiple Injils by identity. Rather, there seems to be just one that is consistently referred to throughout the Quran. Now, Khalil Andani and others might object and say, hang on a sec. Well, the Quran does talk about in Surah Al-Baqarah 75 to 79, Surah Al-Imran 78, Surah Al-Ma'idah ayah 13, and a few others as well, that it does seem to be implying some form of corruption, perhaps even textually. Well, there are problems with this. First is, most of these verses don't clearly talk about textual corruption. Most of them seem to refer about them changing it with their tongues. They distort, they change the order of the words, they put them in different places. It's not clear with the terms that are used what kind of corruption is being referred to, or talif, or which kind of corruption is being referred to. But I do think there is at least one verse which does indicate a form of textual corruption. The issue with this, and I want everyone to understand this, first of all, early tafsir don't interpret this without context. They apply a context to this, and the context is in the example of the children of Israel altering the message that they had, being given from Allah. That cannot reasonably be seen as a worldwide event that forever corrupted the Torah. First of all, you would have to explain a reasonable hypothesis as how that's actually practical and could have happened. You would have to have all the Jews all agree to alter it in all the same way, regardless of all the differences between these Jewish groups, internationally across the Jewish diaspora, and no one notices or no one writes about this or so on and so forth. I think that's wholly unreasonable, and I don't think a person who's being honest could say anything other than that after having looked into this, that is just not a sufficient reasonable explanation to come to that conclusion. But rather, what seems to be mentioned here is a case of a local, limited case of textual corruption. Again, very similar to what I was talking about before with I could get my Quran and I could alter it. Well, that's a local, limited example of textual corruption, but I've by no means corrupted the Quran. Many Muslims would interject and say, you can't say you've corrupted the Quran because not only do we have other copies of the Quran, but also the Quran has been memorized. It is on the hearts of the believers, the Hafiz, those who have memorized the Quran by heart. Again, likewise in the case with Jews and Christians. The very same reason applies. There's no difference at all in this example. And of course, for Khalil Andani and others, simply having a local event of textual corruption, some Jews got together and altered the Torah that they had at the time while other Jews had the Torah preserved, doesn't demonstrate textual corruption at all. At least it doesn't demonstrate that the text fundamentally has been forever altered. And that's what they need to get out of the dilemma. Or at least it's one of the things they would need. There are other ways I think they can get about it, but this would be the main one. Khalil Andani gives an argument as to all of the verses which talk about how it confirms what is with them. He seems to brush this off as well. Confirm could have a different meaning that doesn't quite mean what we think it means. To be fair to him, I think he then elaborates and says, well, it's actually just certain aspects of these scriptures. And this to me is very much special pleading. Very much special pleading. The argument goes like this. In the Quran, whenever there are verses like 543, where Muhammad tells some Jews to follow the commandments of the Torah, that this isn't him saying the Torah is preserved and therefore valid for use. He's actually only telling them very explicitly to look at the laws contained within it and to enact those laws. Likewise, the same thing when you get to 547, it talks about the Injil, 568 as well, that this is in effect just saying only the laws are what's being talked about here, not the actual text as a whole, or the tradition, or the oral tradition as a whole. The problem I have first and foremost with this is, again, it screams special pleading. There's nowhere in the Quran that explicitly states this as, by the way, Surah Al-Imran ayah 3, there's nothing in that says, by the way, when I mean that Allah sent the Torah and the Injil, I only mean this part of it. Or, for example, 547, there's nothing in there that implies a kind of partialness, that it is only the legal aspect of things, the legal judgments, and not the theology, the history, the poetry, any other type of genre of language. Also, it's worth pointing in mind that opinion on this is also varied. Some Muslims will go further than this, and they will say, okay, well actually it's the historicity that's affirmed, and it's the legal rulings, and it's the moral teachings. The only thing they don't want, in a lot of cases I've noticed, is just the theology. It's just the nature of God or the nature of Jesus. These things they don't want to say. They don't want to affirm. But again, there's no reason to think that in the Quranic text. It just doesn't do that. Now, what you could do is you could say, well, there are verses in the Quran that seem to talk about theological statements about Isa, about how he is not the Son of God, how he is just a mere man, how he used to eat food, so on and so forth, and hence that this is a clear, explicit statement that the Quran is disagreeing with things in the Injil, and you can use that as a way of saying, well then clearly the Quran knows about this and it's intentionally going against it. But notice that this is kind of confirmed the very point of the Islamic dilemma. And this, in effect, it's kind of a less likely way of solving the issue. It's admitting that the Islamic dilemma does actually pass, but that's okay because we just think that was the intention. You're being asked to believe that, on the one hand, you have what I would consider the Occam's razor version, which goes something like this. Whoever revealed the Quran claimed to reveal what is in the Torah and the Injil as a proof for the Quran and the prophethood of Muhammad. They then make statements in that Quran that contradict those prior scriptures. They must have erred when doing this. And you can go further into that. You can talk about how they were non-literate in that place, but they wouldn't have had access to an actual Arabic text to validate. Muhammad himself, according to tradition, didn't read or write, so on and so forth. That's the one hand. The simplest approach, we can compare that to what you're being asked to believe. If you're a Muslim and you want to hold to this, you want to solve this, what you have to believe on this hand is, actually, when Allah revealed the Quran, he was revealing it in such a way that he wanted you to know that the Torah and the Injil are inspired revelation from Allah at the time of Muhammad, but only certain parts of it, and only the certain parts are being referred to, even though this isn't explicit. And you can figure this out by going through a process of finding everywhere where the Quran disagrees with the prior scriptures, assuming the Quran is correct in that, assuming the Quran has the authority to do that and to base that largely just on one verse. Ignore the fact this would have been a very poor argument in the historical context of the Christians and Jews who were hearing it, because they would have known immediately that it doesn't confirm their texts. Ignore the fact there's no textual evidence that supports your thesis, because every single manuscript we have of the supposed Injil either is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or some of the Gnostic Gospels that don't work with Islam in any sense. None of it points to an Islamic Injil or Torah, so there's no evidence there. Have a very weird understanding about how those who followed Isa will be triumphant and will stay the uppermost until the day of judgment. You have to have a weird understanding of how that works. The level of theological problems that you have on this view compared to this very simple, very basic view is just not comparable. And this is why I find it quite shocking when people try and solve the Islamic dilemma by taking really radical and extreme theological interpretations that lead to, well, let's put it this way, very weird theology. Let's just think of it this way. Let's take Khalil Andani's understanding of the Injil. At least the way he gives what he thinks is the most likely explanation, because he gives more than one. But the one that he puts forward is the idea that within the gospel canon, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you can find within it kind of like a skeleton text or some sort of underlying text that is present, that contains the actual sayings of Jesus, but it's just covered in blasphemy. It's covered in statements like Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus died and resurrected, Jesus can be prayed to and he will answer your prayers, Jesus knows everything the Father knows, Thomas calling Jesus God, Jesus being worshipped, Matthew 28, the Trinitarian formula. We can just keep going through all of these. You would have to think, as a valid way of looking at scripture and looking at how Allah works through the world and works through prophets, he allows the message to be highly distorted and probably largely forgotten. Because remember, you think this has been corrupt. That doesn't just mean it's sandwiched between corrupt things. It also means that it's probably been lost to a significant degree. You have to think that Allah accepts that and continues to use it and make no qualifying statements in later revelation, the Quran, that tells you that this happened explicitly, even though this is one of the very central points the Quran makes. It says in many verses that, look, this Quran has come to confirm what you have, and that's how you can know that this is legit. This is a legit revelation. It doesn't differ from what you have. It is a confirmation of what you have. But then you have to believe that, well, actually, what Allah means by that is that it's like a sandwiched mess of blasphemous statements from the Islamic paradigm. And then buried within it are just these nuggets of truth that are still Jesus' words that have been preserved. But I mean, by this logic, to think about how bizarre this is as a methodology of establishing Allah's workings in the world, his providence, you would have to think that I could write incredibly anti-Islamic statements in a book and then just somewhere write something like Tawheed is true, and this would be something that Allah could actually give the thumbs up to. He would have no problem with this, presumably, because the Quran never made any explicit statement to say that the Injil is not to be trusted. It's not to be just accepted wholesale. There is no mention of that at all. Every textual corruption verse seems to be in a local context. Most of them not even about writings. Most of them about talif al-mana by another function, like through oral sayings. It just becomes, I would say, less and less likely. And I think I guess when we talk about debates and we talk about how we want to find truth, the amount of additional psychological burden you would have to wear as a Muslim to hold that this actually is the case, I think would be so overwhelming that if I was a Muslim, I wouldn't want to wear that. I think that would be, I would feel foolish, in all honesty, just my opinion, and I don't want to offend anyone, and that's not my intent, but I would feel foolish if I had to say, I can solve the Islamic dilemma, I just have to have these very odd and obscure theological beliefs, because I know that in my heart I couldn't accept that. I think I would have made a lesser god, basically. I would have turned Allah into a lesser god. He affirms blasphemous things in like a packaged way, and he gives you this super secret code to decipher it because he never explicitly says it in his revelation. Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot to hold. So I'm going to leave it at that for now. I just wanted to record this video real quick just to get my thoughts down. There's a lot more that can be said about this, but I think what this hopefully demonstrates is that the evidence overwhelmingly favors the Islamic dilemma as passing. I think that to get out of it, you have to do somersaults and backflips that cause serious issues in other areas. But predominantly, the main problem is just that it's just less likely than the alternative. The alternative is very basic. It is purely that whoever wrote the Quran did not have a proper understanding of what the canon was. I mean, if you accept that, which seems to be supported by the Quranic text, given the fact it doesn't just limit itself to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I mean, that's just the Injil. When you look at the Torah, it's even more profound. You can find Genesis Rabbah, Book of Jubilees, you can find all this other influences there. I mean, and then you can get into the whole Alexander romance stuff, I mean, the amount of additional things the Quran seems to have no problem referring to, I think just demonstrates so overwhelmingly that the Quran is either not aware of it, or, as Gabriel Reynolds makes a point for, just does not care. The Quran is not trying to tell you what the canon is. It has no intent on that. It's just not an objective of the Quran. The Quran is more considered with using sources that people are familiar with and having them point to the validity of the message that it's giving itself. It's a very polemical work, and the more you read the Quran, I think it's clear it is a very polemical work. I mean, we can go into tons about this, the historicity of some of the things it mentions that just doesn't add up, and I think from a Quranic paradigm it's fine, because I don't think the Quran intends to tell you history. It just assumes you already know history. It already assumes the validity of Musa and Abraham from a historical perspective and Isa, but it will freely quote stories about them if it helps them make their point, if it's known to their audience, even if it's not really historic. The Quran doesn't mind. That was not the intent of the Quran. I think that's overwhelmingly clear by the way the Quran is structured and the stories it contains, the contents of the stories it contains. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have an awesome day. If you're not a Christian and you're thinking about becoming a Christian, you can email me at chris@speakerscorner@gmail.com. My email is in the link down below. God bless you all. Have a awesome day. Take care.